Thank you. Good morning, well, it's morning for us. Good afternoon to you. We want to talk about here is our book, Cooperation and Coercion. And the premise of this book is that if you think about humans and how they approach problems, we approach all problems in one of two ways. We either cooperate, we work together in some voluntary fashion, or we coerce, that is, some of us tell others by force what they will or will not do. And once you understand that all human activity falls into one of these two categories or a combination of the two, it becomes rather easy to start asking questions like which form of organization is best suited to which problem. And we started out this book kind of as an attempt to argue that cooperation was universally the right answer. And the further we got into it, the more we realized that that's actually incorrect. Coercion does play a role, and an important role, but the role should be limited. And this goes back to what our founders set forth in our Constitution, which is that, yes, there should be a government, and the government should have specific powers, mostly aimed at protecting people's property rights and serving as an arbiter of disagreement. But other than that, the federal government should be kept in tight control, because coercion, although a necessary tool, is a very dangerous one. And so our conversation with cooperation and coercion begins with the idea of the knowledge problem. And that is that central planners, the coercive class, simply don't have enough information to be able to make decisions for us that are on average better than the decisions we can make for ourselves. And the truth of this is so fundamental that often we are completely unaware of it unless it's pointed out. So we think about very simple things like deciding what to have for lunch. And if we were to make such decision via coercive means, what would we have? We'd have one person who has to decide what each person is going to have for lunch. And suppose we're dealing with a simple case of there's just 20 people in the room. What sorts of considerations does this person have to be looking at? I have to, if I'm the central planner, I have to consider what sorts of dietary restrictions people have. What are their various differences in tastes? What sorts of allergies do they have? Did they eat breakfast? What did they have for breakfast? How does that impact what they might want for lunch? And as I, the central planner, attempt to make the best decision I possibly can for these 20 people, I'm going to come up short. I'm going to come up short because I simply don't know enough to be able to make these decisions better than the individuals can make for themselves. So what do we do when we have lunch for 20 people? We don't organize it via coercion, we organize it by cooperation. You put a table out with a bunch of food and you invite people to come and take what you want, take more, take less, whatever it is, and each person makes the decision for him or herself what they're going to have. And those decisions are importantly not perfect. But the question isn't which organizing principle is perfect. The question is which is better. And on average, those individuals will be able to make better decisions for themselves than I can make for them. Now, once we realize that something as simple as ordering lunch is not well suited to a coercive form of organization, we can extend that thought to things like healthcare and ask, is this really something that we should be leaving to central planners to decide what sorts of things should or should not be covered by insurance and what prices they should charge and all these sorts of things? And what you can see immediately are the flaws in a coercive approach. Now, having said that, we might as a society decide that we want everyone to have health care. And so we don't want to leave it solely to a cooperative venture where you choose what you want or don't want. And some of us actually may not be able to choose to have health care at all. And so what that calls to mind is some sort of a hybrid system where you use coercion in some form to assure that everyone has health care, if indeed that is your goal. But that's the extent of the coercion. Everything beyond that is left to cooperation, to individuals and their healthcare providers determining what sorts of solutions they'll come up with. And we're encountering that question right now in the United States as we discuss universal basic income. We have in this country literally hundreds of programs all aimed at helping the poor, all sorts of things from income assistance to help with electricity bills, to help with housing, these sorts of things. And that's a very coercive approach, that we've set up all of these systems, and if you're poor enough, you fall into the system and we'll tell you what you will have. You can live here in this sort of a housing and we'll provide a certain amount of money and these sorts of things. An alternate approach, if we're agreed that the state has a role in making sure that everyone has some basic standard of living, is to use a UBI, universal basic income. So here, the state simply cuts a check. You cut a check to every person for a certain amount of money, and then you leave it to cooperation. You leave it to the marketplace, to individuals to decide what sorts of things they'll do with this money. And I'm not advocating a UBI. What I am attempting to do is point out that the importance of thinking about human organization from the perspective of coercion and the perspective of cooperation, and that what we're dealing with is not necessarily a binary world of we choose one or we choose the other, but rather a continuum where it's possible to achieve some of the more social outcomes that we want to achieve, but to achieve them by shouldn't use the word cooperating, achieve them by working with markets as opposed to working against them.
So curiously, Ant, this idea of a knowledge problem is as old as the philosophical record in the Western world, right? Because we've got quite a lot through Plato about Socrates, telling us that Socrates himself often said that he knew nothing. And that's a really strange thing for probably the father of Western philosophy to say. But the more you read Plato, the more you realize that that's exactly the right thing for him to say, given his character type. And if you fast forward a couple of thousand years later, we've lost that message, and our bureaucrats really do think they have the requisite knowledge to do just about anything they want by force of law. But I think it does us well to remember one of the smartest men who ever walked the earth a couple thousand years ago, who said quite clearly, that's not possible. There's no way we could know that. There's no way I could know that. That ignorance is really the defining characteristic of the human race, and that's fine, as long as you act in accordance with what that really means, where the rubber meets the road, right? To become coercive through what you think you know, right? To operationalize what you think you know is always a problem. To offer to be cooperative on what you're pretty sure you don't know fully is always a benefit. And that's about where we stand on these two things, right? Yes, coercion is absolutely necessary from time to time. And this need go no further than thinking about the rules of the road, right? We all are coerced into driving in much the same way. And that is absolutely coercion. And you see where it gets into our lives in any number of other ways. And generally speaking, it's fine. When it gets too personal, when it goes too far, we've got a problem. But when it's kept on this basic level of almost like the architecture of the human lives that we're trying to control a little bit, as long as we're there, we tend to be okay. It's when we try to do too much using the blunt force tool of government, where we come to beat each other over the heads with rule books, that we have all of our problems. So I think the first issue when we start thinking about things in terms of the knowledge problem are first we have to be humble enough to admit that we might not know everything. And that seems much harder than it first appears to be. After that, we have to say something like, let's take a look at what everybody's up to. I bet there's a right answer out there somewhere, but you have to be open to it. You have to be looking for it. And these sorts of questions yield a limited government in every instance, right? The more you ask these questions, the more limited government gets. It never yields a condition of anarchy, but it yields a condition of minarchy every time it's applied. The problem is getting it to the table, because so many people just walk right past it and think that coercion is step one. And to those people, we've got a real uphill climb to explain to them that that is not correct.
Yeah, and I think we tend to default toward coercion because of what James and I called is the image of the magic wand of government. We somehow think that all we need to do if we see a problem is to pass a law that says the problem should no longer exist. And lo and behold, the problem disappears. And in fact, that's not at all what happens, because people don't respond to laws. They respond to incentives.
Wait a second. This is how Bernie Sanders solved the problem of poverty.
Right. Yes. Right. Let college be free, then you get free college.
Sure. So he solved that. He solved that problem too, and I think he also solved the medical problems that we have by lowering the price of all kinds of medical procedures and medicines.
Right. Yeah. Let healthcare be free, and lo and behold, it's free. And the problem is, when you start to think a little bit more like an economist, you realize that people aren't responding to the laws, they're responding to the incentives and the incentives that the laws create. And when we use this force of coercion, a couple of things happen that we really don't want to happen. One is that it becomes very difficult to find better solutions. In a cooperative venture where we're all working voluntarily, if we're working towards some goal and we're just not achieving it, we're going to stop. People are going to drop out and say, look, this is a waste of my time, or it's a waste of my money, or whatever it is. I'm going to go do something else. And so naturally, with cooperation, solutions that don't work die out. And we're constantly looking for better solutions. And when one shows up, it will attract people and say, yeah, I want to do that thing because that works. Now contrast that with coercion. With coercion, when the government steps in and says, here's the solution we're going to apply to this problem, it immediately creates a bunch of constituencies, people who have an incentive not to pursue the solution, but not to pursue a better solution, but rather to pursue this particular solution that the government has selected. And I give you as an example, in the United States, this ongoing, and by ongoing, I mean this is a decades-long conversation we've been having about public schooling. Public schooling in this country, generally speaking, not in every case, but generally speaking, is abysmal. And it persists precisely because it is the product of a coercive system. The state steps in and says, there will be education, it will look like this. And what has emerged? What has emerged are teachers' unions, textbook publishers, politicians, all of whose livelihoods depend on this particular solution. And because they have the force of the state behind them, this is coercive, they can prevent people from pursuing alternative solutions that are better. And so we get stuck in this miasma of horrible public education going on for decades, precisely because it has the force of coercion behind it. So that's one problem that emerges from coercion. The other problem that emerges is unintended consequences. That as people react to the coercive force of government, they react in ways that government didn't anticipate. All sorts of weird things start to happen. James, you know the story of the Starbucks coffee lids?
Yeah, I kind of remember that, right? Because the Starbucks, as a concern, had to replace the lids for some reason, to use less plastic, I guess, was the ultimate goal.
Yeah, California. Yeah.
It was a California thing, and they ended up making the lids shaped such that it was actually a net increase on plastic usage.
Yeah.
So not exactly what they were running after as a solution.
Yeah, the drinks that they were selling required straws. California outlaws straws because of plastic. Yeah, so Starbucks comes up with this convoluted lid that will do kind of the same thing as a straw, but actually ends up using more plastic.
It's a little embarrassing, right, to be from the United States when we have to start talking about bans on straws. And yet we've got them. And one thing that came to replace the paper or the plastic straw was the metal straw that you could purchase once and bring with you from place to place, which is already teetering on the cliff of asinine where I come from. It is just stupid. I don't leave my house with my trusty straw because I might want a beverage later in the day. But one woman did, and she managed to fall down with it in her hand, pierced her eye, went into her brain, and killed her. And if you want to talk about unintended consequences in the fight of straw versus human, straw sometimes wins.
Here in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia is our major city, and the Philadelphia City Council became disturbed at obesity amongst children. And so they passed a law that would not banning sugary drinks containing high amounts of sugar, but imposing a high tax. I think it was like 30% tax on sugary drinks. And of course,
just for a second, do you know what was included in the massive tax increase on sugary drinks?
No.
Non-sugary drinks, sugar-free drinks were included.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's because they didn't trust the cashiers to differentiate one to the next.
Amazing.
So, well, all the diet sodas, all the fruit juices, you name it, all that kind of stuff, right in the list with everything else.
And on its face, if you're approaching this problem from a coercive perspective, it looks reasonable. If you want kids to stop drinking sugary drinks, make it more expensive for them to obtain them. And what happened subsequently, and this tax was passed a couple of years ago, since then, the data has come out, and the data indicate that consumption of sugary drinks amongst young people has not declined. Instead, what has declined are grocery store sales in Philadelphia. Because what happened? You've got to pay more for the sugary drinks. So what do the parents do? They say, I'm going to drive outside of Philadelphia to buy the sugary drinks where I can get them at a 30% discount. Oh, and by the way, since I'm driving anyway and going to a store, I might as well do the rest of my grocery shopping. And so grocery store sales within Philadelphia plummeted, shuttering many businesses. This is an unintended consequence.
The city council there didn't really ban sugary drinks. They banned trips to the grocery store.
Yes.
Effectively, that's what they banned. And people who had the means to go to New Jersey in their cars, they did. Not surprising, right? Not surprising. We could have predicted some of these. Others we never could have predicted, right? Every now and then an unintended consequence comes along and you think, wow, I never would have seen that coming.
Yeah.
But a lot of them you really can, and you wonder who's asleep at the wheel, right? When these things are being bandied about.
One of the interesting, I call it an unintended consequence that we didn't anticipate, and it's not entirely clear why this happens, but it's clear that it does happen. If you go back looking at federal revenue numbers, federal government for the United States, going back to the 1950s, federal revenues have been a relatively constant 18% of GDP. It fluctuates a little bit, maybe going down to a low of 16 and up to 20, but basically it's at 18% across the board, 18% of GDP. And that's kind of weird because over that period from 1950 to the present, we've gone through periods where we have taxed the rich at 90+%. The tax on the rich has dropped to below 30%. We've taxed capital gains a high amount. We've taxed capital gains a low amount. We've taxed payroll a low amount and payroll a high amount. We've taxed estates, inheritances by north of 70%, all the way down to 0%. So the tax rates and what we're taxing have changed remarkably over this period of 1950 to the present. And yet, federal tax revenues remain a pretty constant 18% of GDP. Now, what that says is there's some unintended consequence going on here, that as politicians exercise the coercive force of taxation and say, okay, we need to raise more money, so we're going to raise taxes, which is the wording they use, we will raise taxes. In fact, the politicians can't raise taxes, they can only raise tax rates. Taxes are what happens when you combine the tax rate with people's behavior. And lo and behold, this changes of tax rates have caused an unintended consequence of altering people's behavior in such a way that the tax revenue that comes out the back end is pretty much the same. It doesn't change.
And when it's always the same, and it really is always the same, you've got some hard questions to answer. It does seem to be the case that whatever the rate is, the American people are willing to spend 18%. Now, you can make that rate 93%, you can make it 7%. They're willing to pay about 18%. And Congress, for whatever its reasons, builds in enough what we call loopholes for people to get away with paying 18%. It's just astonishing how the group that makes the tax rate never really considers what happens next. The people who receive the tax rate never really think about what the tax rate is, right? Everybody just kind of lands, and we're talking for 70 years now. They land right in that same little tight circle. And that's utterly fascinating. It clearly shows what the American people are willing to put up with in terms of the level of taxation. I don't know exactly what it says about the various Congresses who have declared the tax rules along the way that allow these other people to zero right in at that amount that they wish to pay every time.
And so as we think about unintended consequences, and these are unintended consequences of coercion applied in particular areas, perhaps one of the most egregious forms of unintended consequences arise when we use coercive force against an amorphous or unnamed entity, right? And here we have 3 examples of that in this country. We have, over the past 50 plus years, declared war on poverty, on terrorism, and on drugs. We've declared these 3 wars. And the terrorism war is still, the data is still coming in, but the data on the war on drugs and the war on poverty are quite clear that we've lost both of them. We have used the massive coercive force of the state to solve what we perceive to be these 2 problems. And 2 things have happened. 1, the problems haven't gone away. And 2, we have spent a tremendous amount of money on the problems not going away. And perhaps James would throw in it. Go ahead, James.
It's actually curious how much we've spent on these 3 wars against nouns. And Ant and I talk about the wars against nouns all the time. We have spent roughly $30 trillion on these 3 wars. The federal debt in the United States is roughly $30 trillion. And isn't that something? The money that we didn't have that we spent on these wars against nouns that were utterly unwinnable have cost us, not surprisingly, exactly what the federal debt is.
And one of the
holy crap, right?
One of the interesting things that's happened here is that as with other forms of coercion, constituencies have risen around those 3 wars. To stop the drug war now is a huge political problem, because there are literally hundreds of thousands of Americans who make their living precisely because we're waging a war on drugs. And that's not just individual Americans. It goes all the way down to organizations. For example, we have a problem in this country with something called civil asset forfeiture, which means, in essence, that if the police suspect that that assets, car, cash, a home, were used in the commission of a crime, the police can seize that asset without any proof. And in fact, if you, the owner of the asset, want to get the asset back, you have to sue in court and prove a negative. You have to prove that the asset was not used in the course of committing a crime, then you get the asset back. And what's happened is this has created an incentive for police departments. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed the important part. The important part is local police departments, when they seize these assets, they get to keep a portion of the asset. And so this has created an incentive amongst police departments throughout the United States to seize assets, claiming that, well, these assets must have been used in the commission of a crime. They get to keep this. This supports their budget, their operating budget. And an interesting example of this, there's a major highway that runs from, in Texas, the border of Mexico, up through Pennsylvania, through Tennessee, and to New York City. And there's a county within Tennessee where the police routinely set up roadblocks, stopping cars, looking for people who have large quantities of cash. And the claim is that, well, if you've got a large quantity of cash, you probably have that large quantity of cash because you're involved in the drug trade. And so we're going to seize this cash. And of course, the local department gets a portion of this cash. Yes, you can get it back, but it's going to take you a long time and lawsuits. And even then you're not guaranteed you're going to get it back. So it's profitable for the local law enforcement to do this. Now, in response, local law enforcement says, well, this is part of the war on drugs. We're preventing this drug trade between Mexico and New York City by stopping these cars. But here's the interesting thing. The police departments only stop cars on the southbound lane. That is, cars that would be ostensibly coming back from New York City after having sold the drugs. They don't stop the cars on the northbound lanes, the ones that ostensibly would be carrying drugs to New York City. Why? Because keeping a portion of the drugs doesn't do them any good, but keeping a portion of the cash does. And so consequently, you've got this weird situation where we have declared war on drugs and set it up in such a way that our local police departments actually have a financial incentive for the drug trade to continue.
It's really a perfect plan, isn't it, Ant? And the more you look at these sorts of things, the more you realize that the unintended consequences come to rule the day, right? It's always the thing that couldn't be foreseen that comes up as the tail that wags the policy dog. And we've looked at it so often now that we're very, very unsurprised when we see it again. We're actually very surprised when we don't see it. When you find a law that's crafted well enough to avoid most of the obvious problems that come in the wake of these sorts of things. But this is just where we are at this point. And we can say something like, well, the level of regulation and legislation that we face is clearly too high for all the various reasons that are swimming below everything that Anthony just said. But getting anybody to act on that, I think, shared knowledge, right? We all do know that it's out of hand. Getting anybody to work on that in any systematic way is nearly impossible. And you can see it when you take a look at the incarceration rates of people in the United States. We as a nation incarcerate more of our people per capita than any other nation on the face of the earth. And you get a sense that these two observations somehow belong together, that when you regulate to such a degree that a police officer can come upon you and very likely arrest you for one of any number of reasons that you're blissfully unaware of, maybe we've gone too far, right? Just a thought, maybe it's gone too far. And we're going to have a discussion about this at some point down the road, but it's not going to be a pleasant discussion. There are going to be a lot of losers when we're having it, which is how you know we're not going to have it anytime soon.
The title of our book, Cooperation and Coercion, the subtitle is How Busybodies Became Busy Bullies and what that means for economics and politics. Busy bullies is actually a James creation. It's a wonderful word. And what we mean by that is, of course, a busybody is someone who's sticking their nose in your business, who wants to tell you how to live your life, right? And we all have experience of this. Anytime you get together with your elderly aunt, she's going to tell you what you are and are not doing well, right? These are busybodies.
The neighbors next door.
Right, the neighbor next door, right? The problem is when you live in a society that heavily favors coercion as a tool of problem solving, this gives busybodies a power they didn't have before. And we call them busy bullies when they co-opt the power of government. So if I don't like, what you're doing with your lawn or the color you painted your house or what have you, I can co-opt the government and I can use the power of government to force you to live your life the way I think you should live it. And so I become a busy bully. And the war on drugs is one example of this. People saying, understanding, yes, crime associated with drugs is a problem, but put that aside, that is a crime. But simply people owning and doing drugs, we can argue that maybe that's not a good thing to be doing, but that's that person's life. For us to insert ourselves into that person's life and say, you should live your life differently, is to be a busybody, to use the government to punish this person for not living the way we think they should live, is to be a busy bully.
A crime without a victim is not a crime.
Yeah.
Right? Simply put, what we end up with is the legislation of people's preferences. Right. So we make the jump from outlawing criminal activity, which by definition always brings with it a victim. After that, we come to legislate and to regulate on aesthetic grounds, where we don't like that you painted your house purple, please paint it back, this kind of thing. And if you can't identify an immediate victim, I'm here to tell you, you're not dealing with a criminal behavior. And yet we've made that jump. I don't know how it is in Europe at this point, whether you're right there with us on this sort of silliness or if you're out in front or behind. But here in the States, it's become a real issue. It's become a real issue, and it yields inevitably to this condition by which we imprison so many of our own people. Right? These things are intimately related.
This is the war on drugs, one of our 3 wars on nouns. I want to talk for a minute about the war on poverty, because the numbers here are actually quite disturbing.
Yeah.
The poverty rate in the United States was falling precipitously up until about the late 1960s, early 1970s. And perhaps coincidentally, perhaps not, that's the point in time at which the federal government declared its war on poverty. It actually used those words: we will wage war on poverty. Once the government began its war on poverty, the poverty rate that had been falling precipitously stopped falling. And it has hovered at about 13% ever since the late 1960s, early 1970s in this country, since we declared war on poverty. What's interesting is worldwide, poverty rates have continued to fall over that period. In the United States, they remain constant. And so we have, as part of this war on poverty, these hundreds of programs aimed at helping the poor, all of which create weird interactions. For example, we have assistance for low-income people for housing. So if you're low income enough, you qualify, you get some housing assistance that helps you to pay for your living. And of course, and it seems reasonable, as you earn more money, once you cross a certain threshold, you lose that housing assistance. Now, take that effect of providing assistance, not just for housing, but for all sorts of other things, your income in general, the number of children you have, your electric bill, your phone bill, all of these things. And there's a separate program for each one of these. And they start to interact in weird ways, such that, and there's an economist, Clifford Thies, who performed this analysis. He took a hypothetical family of 3 living in the state of Virginia and asked the question, this family of 3, if their household income was 0, they earn nothing, how much assistance would they get from these various poverty programs? And he did the calculations, and they received something like $20,000 worth of assistance per year. And then he asked the question, if this household's income starts to go up from 0 to 10,000 to 20,000 to 30,000, what happens both to the amount of taxes the household has to pay and to this assistance that the household is receiving. And what he found was when you net out the two things, the taxes they have to pay minus the assistance that they're receiving, that this household becomes better off as it goes from 0 to 10,000 to 20,000. But once it hits 20,000, if this household earns any more money, it actually ends up worse off than it did before. Because as it starts to earn more money, its taxes are going up and it's now losing some of this assistance it was gaining before. So his conclusion was, look, if you're this hypothetical household of 3 in the state of Virginia and you're earning $20,000, don't try to earn any more unless you can immediately jump to 40,000. Once you jump to 40,000, from that point on, as you earn more money, what you're left with at the end is it makes you better off. And so we have inadvertently created this poverty gap that once a poor person approaches it, there are strong financial incentives for that person to remain poor. And again, people have a financial incentive for this to remain in place. All of the people who are employed in all of the various programs that support, that handle these poverty programs, they're all out of jobs if we make this poverty gap disappear.
And the crazy thing here, Ant, is that all of these programs are just, by the time you consider all of them simultaneously, it's Byzantine, right? It's just this walking map through the various social programs that the United States offers. Almost impossible for any human being to understand them all, how they work together, what the costs and benefits are, unless you're a person who is on that assistance, because those people understand it inside and out. And they know just how to get the most from the system, given the various rules that have been built in, right? I don't say this in a mean-spirited sort of way. I think it's actually interesting that they can come to understand these things. And I know that necessity is the mother of invention here. It is. But the only people who actually understand this with any clarity at all are the people who are on these programs. The people who write the programs don't even understand them all that particularly well, but the people who need them do, and they choose accordingly.
This goes back to where we started of, as we think about cooperation and coercion, it's most useful not to think about them as binary options, but rather as a continuum. If indeed it's the case that we agree that the federal government has some role in preventing poverty or to helping the poor, the right way to do this is to use the minimal amount of coercion, as opposed to what we've done is to use the maximal amount of coercion, where we have people making judgments as to how you will spend your money and what sorts of assistance you're going to have and this sort of thing. And here's an interesting case. If since the war on poverty began in the 1960s, the federal government has spent on all of its various programs, adjusted for inflation, $22 trillion. $22 trillion fighting poverty since the 1960s. If instead of taking a coercive approach, we had taken a more cooperative approach, something like, we're not going to have all of these rules about the housing assistance or your phone assistance or electrical assistance or whatever it is. Instead, we're going to cut you a check. We would have been able to cut a check for $10,000 every single year for every poor American. For the same $22 trillion, that would have completely eliminated poverty. The poverty rate would have been 0 ever since 1960. And yet we didn't take this more cooperative approach to solving the problem. We took the more coercive approach because it goes back to the magic wand of government. We saw a problem, the problem was poverty, and so our knee-jerk reaction is, let's pass a law fixing this problem. And it didn't fix it, it actually perpetuated it.
And you can see the upshot of this line of thinking by just considering 2 United States presidents. Lyndon Johnson declares war on poverty. Fast forward to the 1980s, Ronald Reagan gets up on a podium and says, we declared war on poverty, poverty won. I don't know what could make it more stark than that. Poverty won. And there was absolutely no reason why that had to be the case. It needn't have won.
We've been giving examples about the United States here, but we can extend this analysis globally. And instead of looking at the costs of coercion, let's go the other direction, look at the benefits of cooperation. There's no clear way to measure this, right? But the phenomenon that we're going to talk about is economic freedom. There's a variety of ways, variety of institutions that attempt to measure economic freedom. The Fraser Institute is my favorite because their data set is the broadest and the longest going back in time. And what Fraser does, as many other institutions do, Heritage Foundation is one, for example, it will look at states and within the United States and countries across the world. It even has a new data set that looks at cities, and it asks questions about economic freedom, which is in essence what we're talking about when we say cooperation. And so it asks questions like, how difficult is it to start a business? How many loopholes do you have to jump through? How long does it take? How much of your income do you get to keep as an individual? How much unnecessary regulation exists? That's on the cooperation side. And on the proper coercion side, how much rule of law is there? Is it the case that that if you're wronged, you can bring a case to a court and the court decides this fairly in a relatively quick period of time? So Fraser looks at all sorts of things like this, and it puts a stamp on the country that indicates its level of economic freedom. And what's fascinating is if you cross-reference Fraser's Economic Freedom Index with data coming from the United Nations, from the World Bank, that indicate quality of life. So things like, of course, per capita income, things like unemployment rates, poverty rates, income inequality, gender inequality, child labor rates, even environmental degradation. If you cross-reference the economic freedom data with these socioeconomic outcome data, what you find, not in every case, but in the vast majority of cases, there's a very clear trend. And the trend is countries that embrace more economic freedom, that is on this scale of cooperation and coercion, they move more toward the cooperative side, not abandoning coercion, but moving more toward the cooperative side. Those countries score better. Not only cross-sectionally, in a given year they score better, but going back over decades, they consistently score better. And you can track this as countries move and they become less economically free, their scores tend to fall. As they become more economically free, their scores tend to rise. And what all of this suggests is that cooperation really is, let me rephrase, cooperation supported by the necessary but minimal amount of coercion, the amount of coercion that protects people from harming, prevents people from harming each other. That level of cooperation is the level of cooperation that achieves the most good across all sorts of metrics. James, you want to say something?
No, I agree with every single thing you just said, which makes sense given that we wrote it into a book together some time ago. And, you know, we take a fair amount of heat from libertarians who want there to be no government at all. We take a real fair amount of heat from anarchists, but we are neither libertarians nor anarchists, right? We are classical liberals. We fall in line with Jefferson and Madison and those sorts of fellows, along with, you know, a number of people from continental Europe and England for the general philosophy that underlies the Enlightenment. We're not lunatics, come to find out, and the market badly wants lunatics, so we're shuttered off to a corner. But our kind of people in that corner are becoming more self-aware, and that group is growing. And we find that if you just say things like, well, the government exists to do these three things, quite simply, and leave you alone the rest of the time, reasonable people have reasonable reactions to that sort of thing. And that's where we've laid our bet. We suspect that change, to the extent that we can get it, is coming there. And we'll be waiting for everybody when they get there.